The Ukrainian armed forces have recently started to carry out a historic offensive operation. Ukrainian Eastern Forces Group spokesman Colonel Sergei Sharavathy stated that the Ukrainian forces advanced up to 500 meters in the direction of Bakhmut and continued to attack the Russian flanks. It was the Azov Battalion of Ukraine's 3rd Assault Brigade that made this progress. This striking offensive operation, which began in the city of Bakhmut, spread to the front lines in the surrounding areas of the city. But Bakhmut was at the center of the attacks. Russia, on the other hand, accepted Ukraine's continued counterattack against the flanks of Bakhmut, near Bodanivka and Ivanivka. Bodanivka is located northwest of Bakhmut. There is also about 5 kilometers between Bakhmut and Bodanivka. Ukrainians have established a very reasonable logistics network between these two cities. On the other hand, Ivanivka is located in the southwest of Bakhmut. Between these two cities, there is approximately 6 kilometers. The situation is the same in Chusovaya, west of the war stronghold Bakhmut. Ukrainians completed their military preparations in this area and began to take action. In other words, the Ukrainian army, which completed all its preparations, started to carry out successive attacks on the eastern front lines with its special forces and artillery units as part of this successive offensive operation. Ukrainian forces have recently swept through the entire Russian front line with tanks, artillery, and kamikaze drones. As the Ukrainian army continued to gradually target the Russian trenches and military resources, very striking images emerged. Perhaps these images were some of the clearest tangible evidence of Ukrainian efforts since the beginning of the war. So how were these moments clearly reflected on the cameras? The Ukrainian armed forces frequently resorted to artillery strikes, tanks, unmanned aerial vehicles, and many missile systems to carry out the offensive operations they launched. These UAVs used by the Ukrainian forces immortalized the most remarkable moments of the great offensive plans that Kiev had planned for a long time. International intelligence sources suggest that the Ukrainian military often uses a drone to record video in airstrikes. This tactic is used to completely destroy the opponent's psychology because the Ukrainian armed forces share the video footage they recorded on social media. After each successful attack they carried out, the Ukrainian army has recently launched a massive chain of offensive operations against Russian artillery munitions. Now we're going to one of those moments. Our first stop is Bakhmut, north direction. This area lies between the city of Yakima and the border of Bakhmut. Recently, the drone of the Ukrainian forces burned down the entire Russian line with an explosive in this region. Yes, you heard right. Soldiers from Ukraine's 68th Jaeger Brigade dropped explosives into a Russian trench using an armed drone. A great fire broke out as the explosive reached the Russian trenches. Russian front lines in the shape of a labyrinth began to burn in a short time with the effect of the explosion. These striking moments were recorded second by second by the UAV used by the Ukrainian 68th Jaeger Brigade. This attack is thought to have been carried out on the northern lines in the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. Following the attack, no data was shared about the missing information. However, the possibility that the Russian forces were in the trenches at the time of the explosion increases the impact of the attack. After this attack, the Ukrainian forces continued their operations on the eastern front lines without slowing down the fire of the offensive. Operations that started in Bakhmut gradually spread to the entire Donetsk and Luhansk region. In another offensive operation, the 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Army took the stage. This time the address of the offensive operation was the Obliterated border lines in the south of Bakhmut. A UAV belonging to the Ukrainian army was gliding towards the Russian trenches in this area loaded with explosives. Unexpectedly, the bomb dropped from the UAV of the Ukrainian forces was displayed in the air. The explosive that fell to the ground in a very short time caused large flames to erupt on the surface. This stunning image was released by the 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Air Assault Force. However, It's not clear that the 79th Air Assault Brigade carried out the drone attack operation. According to some assumptions, this brigade is the unit that broadcast the video, but another Ukrainian military unit may have carried out the operation. Following the successful offensive operation by the Ukrainian forces, the tension on the front lines did not decrease. On the contrary, the Ukrainians increased the tempo they caught by carrying out attacks one after the other. The center of the offensive operation this time was the document front line, where the great offensive of the Ukrainian army began. These striking images of the operation, which was carried out in all location with buildings side by side in the forested land of Bakhmut, were shared by the 45th Artillery Brigade. According to these breathtaking images, shared Ukrainian troops destroyed a Russian artillery and ammunition depot near Bakhmut. When we examine the recorded moments in detail, we can understand that a group of Russian soldiers were dealing with artillery. This shows us that these Russian soldiers were unaware of this attack, because when the 45th Artillery Brigade of the Ukrainian army carries out the offensive operation, the Russian soldiers are running around, unsure of what to do. But the explosion is so violent that the UAV of the Ukrainians recording the video manages to reveal all the violence of the attack. As the artillery strikes of the Ukrainian forces take place, a huge flame and huge waves of smoke appear. When the attack is over, these fumes linger for a long time. After this mind-blowing attack in Bakhmut, Ukraine's 45th Artillery Brigade was on the move again near the city. Ukraine's 45th Artillery Brigade is again conducting another offensive operation in the wooded area of Bakhmut, close to the site of the first attack. These striking moments were also reflected on the cameras. However, we must state that the severity of this attack carried out by the 45th Artillery Brigade was much greater than the first. When you take a look at the images, you will realize that the effect of the artillery ammunition is much more. After finding the target, the smoke that emerged after the attack almost reaches the unmanned aerial vehicle of the Ukrainian forces, which captured these moments. On the other hand, the 45th Artillery Brigade did not make a single move in this offensive operation. Artillery attacks have occurred repeatedly in these areas, which are used as Russian warehouses and military command centers located next to each other in the mentioned area. While the Russian army continued to suffer great wounds with these offensive operations, which we mentioned, the special units of the Ukrainian armed forces continued to increase the dosage of the offensive operations. This time, Ukraine's 501st Battalion carried out a striking offensive operation. This unit, which is the Naval Brigade of the Ukrainian Army, carried out a violent attack on the Russian positions and military resources in the Donetsk region. In the images, you can clearly see the attack carried out by the Ukrainian forces in a field close to the railway track of the Donetsk region. This time, the Ukrainians targeted the trenches that the Russians had set up very close to the train line. The heroic soldiers of the Ukrainian Naval Brigade destroyed these trenches of the Russians with pinpoint attacks. After the attack, it becomes clear how the trench lines made by the Russian troops using wood were dispersed. The striking images also showed that the Ukrainian Marine Brigade was conducting search and reconnaissance activities in the area after the attack. The soldiers of the Ukrainian Naval Brigade marching among the destroyed Russian trenches made a serious effort to take the surviving Russian soldiers. It's not shared how many Russian soldiers surrendered as a result of the operation, but it is estimated that a platoon of Russian soldiers surrendered after the striking attacks of the 501st Battalion. So what do these successive attacks mean? Considering all these offensive operations, we must first state that the Ukrainian armed forces have carried out a major offensive operation, especially in the last few days. But this operation is a little different from the old ones because, as can be seen from the images we shared with you, the Ukrainian forces are acting very systematically. When we examine the videos, it seems as if the time and order of each operation has been predetermined. If this is true, The Russians face a very serious danger considering the serious tensions between Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin in recent days. The planned action of the Ukrainian army could have very serious consequences for Russia. The fact that the number of casualties of the Russian army exceeds 200,000 is already a great record. However, if the Ukrainian army continues its attacks without disturbing the systematic, perhaps the losses of the Russian army can be carried to much more extreme points. As we all know, if the military losses of an army are to such a level that they can no longer be shared with the press, the top names in government officials who lead the war in the country where that army is located may have to do something. When we adapt this situation for Russia, results such as the resignation of the Kremlin administration or the withdrawal of the Russian army from Ukraine, perhaps with a much greater increase in the losses of the Russian army, can be seen. We will see together whether this possibility will materialize. Ukraine and Russia have been fighting for over a year, but now the Russian military's war effort is largely exhausted. The strategic attacks of the Ukrainian army against the Russian army have a great impact on this. The most recent of these attacks took place last night when Russian railway was hit in Crimea. Let's examine together how the war effort of the Russian army was exhausted and the strategic attacks of the Ukrainian army. Late last night, gunshots and explosions were heard in the town of Tsankawi in northern Crimea. Judging by the videos posted on social media, Tsankawi was attacked by a kamikaze drone. According to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, an incident occurred as a result of the explosion of Caliber missiles transported by rail in the northern region of Crimea. The leader of the Russian-appointed city of Tsankawi confirmed that the railway was attacked by drones. The airstrike successfully blew up the Russian missile train and the railway in the Crimea. Ukraine acknowledged the explosions, but did not openly take responsibility for the incident. If confirmed, this represents a rare action in Crimea, a territory occupied by the Ukrainian military since 2014. The blasts continue the process of Russian disarmament and prepare to free Ukraine's Crimean peninsula from Russian control. Multiple buildings caught fire and the electrical grid was damaged in the attack. A railroad worker was also injured. Ukraine reported that the destroyed Russian Caliber cruise missiles had an operational range exceeding 2,500 kilometers on land and 375 kilometers at sea. Russia accused Ukraine of attacking the Black Sea Fleet with a drone in the Crimean port city of Sevastopol in October 2022. It was stated that 9 unmanned aerial vehicles were used in the attack that damaged a warship. Ukraine did not claim responsibility for the attack. So where were the missiles destroyed by Ukraine going? For some geographical reason, Russian rail traffic is heading north towards Kherson Oblast before heading south to the port of Sevastopol. The presence of calibers in the railway yard in Saki is perfectly understandable since Sukhoi is the hub connecting the Russian railway to Kherson and Sevastopol. Assuming Kherson was under Ukrainian control, the Caliber missiles would probably be deployed to Sevastopol and from there to the Black Sea Fleet. So how will it be possible for the Ukrainian army to take back Crimea? Kherson, which is currently touted as the gateway to Crimea, is under the control of the Ukrainian army. So this gives the Ukrainian army a huge advantage, even though Mariupol, which is the back door of Crimea, is now under Russian control. The Russian defense is weakened due to the attacks of the Ukrainian army on the Russian troops there. In addition, HIMARS, owned by the Ukrainian army, puts the Ukrainian army in a very advantageous position for long-range attacks. However, the fact that the Black Sea Russian fleet still exists on the Crimean coast is a reason that complicates Ukraine's Crimean offensive. For this, the Ukrainian army continues to take important steps to weaken the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Although Ukraine did not take responsibility for the attack, this attack undoubtedly undermined Russia's war efforts in a big way. Some experts consider the attack to be a retaliation by the Ukrainian army to Russian President Vladimir Putin's visit to Crimea and Mariupol. these may not be empty thoughts. Russian President Putin made a surprise visit to the Ukrainian port of Mariupol, which was captured by Russia after it devastated most of its forces. An official video shows Putin driving through the streets at night and talking to people. This trip is believed to be Putin's first trip to Ukrainian territory that came under Russian control after the beginning of the war. Ukrainian officials likened Putin's trip to the criminal's return to the crime scene, stating that he came to see what Putin did and personally see what he would be punished for. Other Ukrainian city officials in exile said that Putin visited the destroyed city at night to avoid seeing it in daylight. Russian officials said Putin went to Mariupol by helicopter. In the video, he is seen in the car with Russian Deputy Prime Minister Marat Kusnulin, describing how the city was rebuilt. The Kremlin said that the decision to walk around the city was made spontaneously by the Russian leader. Putin also visited the city's Philharmonic Hall, which should be used for trials of captured Ukrainian forces before being released in a prisoner exchange. The Russian leader is also reportedly meeting with senior military commanders in Rostov-on-Don, a Russian city just east of Mariupol. So what happened in Mariupol? Mariupol has been under Russian control for more than 10 months after being devastated in one of the longest and fiercest battles of the conflict. Ukraine says more than 20,000 civilians have been killed there. An analysis estimates that 90% of the buildings were damaged and about 350,000 of the pre-war population of about 500,000 were forced to leave the area. A group of Melitopol residents said that Russia is conducting an expensive campaign to rebuild the city and win the hearts and minds of its people. The aim is to assimilate Mariupol and make it the owner of Russia. Russian officials say 300,000 people currently live there. The conflict saw Russia hit the Mariupol theater, where hundreds of civilians took refuge. The building collapsed and at least 300 people are believed to have died there. Ukraine and human rights groups say the attack constitutes a war crime. The United Nations said the Battle of Mariupol was among the events for which Putin and his regime could be held legally responsible. The International Criminal Court said it has issued an order for Putin's arrest in connection with the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. This means that if he sets foot in any of the court's 123 member states, he can be arrested. Putin also made an unannounced visit to Crimea to mark the 9th anniversary of Russia's annexation of territory from Ukraine. He visited a Russian art school in Crimea, a children's summer camp, and future cultural projects such as the New Russia and Christianity museums. Russian officials reported, although the Ukrainian army had unarmed and untrained soldiers in the beginning of the war, President Zelensky is not leaving the people and the army alone. The fact that the vast majority of the people joined the army or took up arms and showed the courage to defend their country to the last person, as Putin claimed. Afterwards, Western states giving the Ukrainian army the most advanced weapons and training Ukrainian soldiers, as well as sharing intelligence with the Ukrainian army, caused the Ukrainian army to gradually pass both psychological and physical superiority. The Ukrainian army recaptured 70% of the Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory in a very short time, with a major offensive launched last fall. Afterwards, the Ukrainian army blocked the supply routes of the Russians, and the Russian army was almost unarmed. And then the Russian troops suffered huge losses on the front line, causing the superiority to pass to the Ukrainian army. Of course, the importance of intelligence sharing and the right strategies cannot be ignored here. Unlike the Russian army, the qualified and disciplined commanders of the Ukrainian army and intelligence units working in coordination with foreign intelligence units successfully hit the coordinates where the Russian elements were located in the situation we are in now. We see that the Ukrainian army is preparing for an attack again and is planning a major attack against the final target of Crimea, Kiev. Authorities have pledged to liberate all areas under Russian control, including Crimea, which was annexed by Russia in 2014. At this point, we see that the Kiev authorities have stood by their promises and liberated the Russian-controlled regions one by one. It's difficult to know what awaits us in the coming days, but we sincerely believe that Ukraine's freedom efforts will come to an end. There is a lot of news. First of all, the Russians conducted a massive missile strike targeting critical civilian infrastructure in different parts of the country. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, the Russians launched 33 rockets in total in the first wave. The Russians attacked the capital of Ukraine with S-300 anti-aircraft missiles from the northern axis. Even though these rockets are mainly used for air defense purposes, the system can be repurposed for surface-to-surface use. In the second wave, the Russians launched Caliber rockets from the Black Sea, cruise missiles from Tu-95 aircraft, and guided missiles of various types. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that they shot down 21 rockets in total, implying a 64% success rate. This is much lower than usual because the Russians used a lot of S-300 missiles in these strikes. These are the worst rockets for the Ukrainians because they are launched from a distance of fewer than 200 kilometers and they fly low and fast, which makes them extremely difficult to intercept. When it comes to the targets that suffered the strikes in Kiev, Vinnytsia, and Burstin, the Russians targeted thermal power plants in other regions. The Russians targeted substations and similar energy facilities. The most successful Russian strike was near Burstin. Judging by the picture, the missiles hit the turbine hall of the station and at least 3 of the station's 12 generators were destroyed. The damage to the building, technical, and steam pipelines make it very difficult to operate the rest of the turbines. Soon after, the energy company Ditech announced that one of the power plants stopped generating energy. And it looks like they are talking about this one. This is extremely bad because this power plant allowed to control the power on the turbines by a quick change in speed, which allowed to balance the energy system more easily. One of the rockets unfortunately hit a residential building in Dnipro. In order to deflect the blame, Russian sources reported that the damage was done by the Ukrainian air defense, which shot its rocket into the building by mistake. However, even separate Russian military bloggers admit that the damage to the building strongly implies that it was a cruise missile. So far, the head of the Dnipro region confirmed that there are 60 casualties. 12 of them are children, but rescue is nowhere near being over, so the number of casualties is expected to increase. Overall, since the beginning of the war, there have been almost 18,000 civilian casualties in Ukraine, around 7,000 killed and 11,000 injured. When it comes to the fronts, the most intense fights continue to take place in the east, in particular in the Solder area. Last time I told you that the advancement of Russian attack groups in solidarity became complicated because the outskirts of the city are somewhat detached from the city center, which puts the attackers at the crossfire. I also mentioned that the Russians started regrouping and deploying their airborne units in the area of Krasna Hora in order to tackle this problem. The main idea of this new plan is to bridge the Ukrainian defense that has been built along the railway embankment. If successful, they would be able to fix Ukrainian troops in Blahodatan and threaten Ukrainian supply and support of the salt mine and move into the outskirts. However, the terrain here is very challenging. As of now, the Russians are controlling this small forest on the hill in Horodnia. If we zoom in, we can see that there are a lot of roads, rails, forests, and gardens. If you look at the topographic map, we can also see the hills. The Russians have already tried to attack Krasno Gor in front by emerging from behind the hill and using their mobile units. However, half of Krasnodar consists of gardens, which means that the Ukrainians have better cover and can allocate more forces to protect this direction. That is why the number of forces that the Russians could launch effectively through the field was not enough to establish control over the outskirts, and that is why they switched to attacking it from the south. Here the Russians are going from Horodnia around the hill, then leverage the tree belts and gardens to attack the closest Ukrainian positions. Almost all Ukrainian positions are at the same elevation, so the Russians can advance here relatively safely. The first Ukrainian positions that the Russians run into are actually closer to Paraskovia than Krasnohorivka. That is why the Ukrainian General Staff includes the settlement in its reports, and that is why some sources incorrectly reported that the Russians already took Krasnohorivka. So far, a lot of clashes are happening near the Garden Center, and Palisivka remains under full Ukrainian control. Overall, the fights are once again shifting to the flanks of Solidarity. The Russians are trying to leverage the local heights to launch attacks from multiple axes, while the Ukrainians are aligned on key tactical positions such as Krasne Horky in order to impede and complicate Russian advances as much as possible. Over the last several days, the pace of Russian advances has indeed slowed down and the number of attacks also decreased, although it is still too early to say whether the front line has stabilized.